Our next session is Conjuring Other Ways of Knowing Plants as a Site for Healing and Change. Our presenter is Chandra Frank, and she's an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Cincinnati and an independent curator. She is the 2024 through 2027 Taft Professor of Public Humanities. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on feminist and queer of color movement, possibilities of dissent, the politics of water, and the ways in which race and environment work as terrains of power. She is the founding member of the Tidal Studies Group, a collaborative collective exploring rhythms, currents, spillage, and intimacies of water. Over the last decade, she has been active as an independent curator and worked with various institutional or international institutions, such as the Bonnefanten Museum, Cincinnati Contemporary Art Center, the 198 Contemporary Arts and Learning, Framed, and District 6 Museum. Please join me in a warm welcome for Chandra Frank. Thank you.
So I'm going to weave together some of my curatorial work and think a little bit about artistic practice and to think about how artistic practice feeds into this idea of plants as a site of healing and change. So for the last couple of years, I've been broadly interested in questions of ecology alongside and in conversation with histories of slavery, colonialism, as well as histories of indentured labor. So as a Dutch South African Indian scholar based in the US, I've been really interested in kind of dealing with the complexities of water and ecology as it's kind of like woven into my own ancestry. So I grew up in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and my mom's side of the family is Dutch. My mom's white Dutch. My family on my father's side is South African Indian, and we arrived, in South Africa by way of British colonialism. And so those histories of indenture have always been really interesting to me. So I've worked with different kinds of like family archives, VHS tapes from family visits to Durban. And then also a lot of my work kind of grapples with the Dutch racial climate and kind of the politics of water. And as mentioned in that very generous bio, kind of thinking about feminist queer of color movement work in the 1980s and how kind of like feminist queer movements, particularly in the 1980s, kind of have interrupted the Dutch racial climate. So I'm going to briefly mention just a little bit of my creative research here and then kind of move into some conversations about some of the exhibitions that I wanted to highlight. So a lot of the work that I just mentioned that I have been doing, I've kind of grouped under tidal politics. I'm kind of mentioning this as a way of acknowledging how I work, my creative praxis, kind of straddling between academia and the arts, and really kind of thinking about creative research as this artistic and visual art form, and also in doing that, kind of disrupting traditional modes of knowledge production, and specifically thinking about interdisciplinary work and collaborative work. So I'm lucky that most of the work that I'll be sharing has been done in collaboration with friends, with colleagues, people that I've known for a long time. And I think I really want to underscore that form of working because it's been a really important way for me to kind of think about this creative research practice and kind of really hone into the politics of collaboration as a way of doing this work. So amongst others, I've been really interested in water. I'm not going to really talk much about water in this presentation, but I wanted to briefly mention some of the work that I've been doing under tidal politics, so kind of thinking with critical walking methodologies, academic projects. I also have this wonderful group that I'm part of, the Tidal Studies Group, and we're all kind of interested in tides, water, mud, swamps, and we're kind of, thinking about ourselves as a loose collective as well as a way for us to kind of sense and feel through ecology. So as we're kind of thinking about plants today, I just wanted to frame some of that work of how I've approached it through the lens of water. And of course, when we're thinking with water, often within this work, we're also thinking with different kinds of ecologies and plants that kind of, how different people in this group, whether they're from the Caribbean or Suriname or different places, how we kind of like bring with us those different stories and ecologies that we like unpack through events and different conversations. Just 2 weeks ago, we organized a Tide Over event. Megan was there, hi, which was a part of the Public Humanities work I do as I'm tied to the Taft Research Center at UC. And this event specifically also informed by my work on tides, but again, also highlighting that kind of interdependence. And I've been really interested in the politics of care, and in this event and kind of conceptualizing this idea of tide over, I've been kind of working with this idea of what does it mean to tide over, right? So usually when we think about tide over, we have this understanding of like we tide over until. And so I've been interested in what is the until, especially under racial capitalism. What is tiding over amid the destruction of ecosystems, or what is until when we kind of come up against the logics of extinction. So a lot of this work and this event was kind of inspired by rethinking that idea of until and like looking for other models of being in relation, and kind of moving away from tiding over as this kind of temporal timeline of lack. And so a lot of that work over the years has kind of culminated in different curatorial projects, collaborations, as I said, events. And I wanted to highlight some of those. Some of you I know have seen this exhibition in 2023, Ecologies of Elsewhere, which was up at the Contemporary Art Museum, which I curated with a really close friend and colleague, Dr. Portia Malaji, who's a curator and senior lecturer in visual cultures at the University of Cape Town, Michaela School of Fine Art. And this exhibition, which was on in 2023, we really wanted to kind of explore how plants, seeds, and botany kind of generate these sensuous systems of knowing and being in the diaspora. And we were interested in how different artists kind of grappled with plants as political, spiritual, and historical relation, and then also how within those modes of relation, plants are situated as multi-species narrators and storytellers. So the exhibition was a group show, as I said, 16 artists. We really wanted to have a diasporic conversation and kind of think about how all these different histories touch, as Lisa Lowe, a scholar that I really admire, kind of speaks about these touching histories. So thinking in relation, histories of colonialism, slavery, and indenture. And so we had artists from the US, Puerto Rico, South Africa, Taiwan, Ghana. I also specifically wanted to mention Abel Rodriguez, who sadly passed away earlier this April, an indigenous artist from Colombia, also known as the plant namer, who worked in the Amazon basin and identified like hundreds of plants, including their medicinal properties, as well as their ecological and cosmological relationship with the environment and other animals. And his work is truly spectacular, really beautiful. And we were really lucky to have it in the show. So in Ecologies of Elsewhere, we were kind of, as I said, making these connections between the ways in which these different histories of slavery and colonialism and migration touch across different geographies. And even though the exhibition was diasporic in a broader sense, there are different artists who do not specifically work on African plant diasporas. For the purpose of our symposium today, I want to highlight some of the artists who do really closely think with African plant diasporas. So I guess before we look at the work of different artists, I wanted to mention also from a curatorial point of view that we were interested in thinking how this kind of work around ecologies and plants translates into exhibition spaces, specifically because we were interested in, can exhibition spaces actually become these places where we sense and feel differently with plants? And of course, there are all sorts of limitations to bringing live plants into the exhibition space. It makes galleries and museums really nervous once you start like thinking about, planned installations. We had in the show a really amazing artist who was at DAP, Lorena Molina, who some of you I know, professor at UC who's from El Salvador, was based in Cincinnati, who's now based in San Francisco. And she really wanted to do like a corn maze and kind of, creating that and going through the different stages of thinking with corn. Which we really wanted to accommodate, but it was just really complex. And again, there were all sorts of like, concerns around bugs, how it would kind of, potentially impact other works in the exhibition. And so, it was kind of interesting to kind of think about the politics of care in a very material way when we're trying to bring plants into the exhibition space, and how the artworks in itself kind of represent these different cycles, and there are different stages of aliveness of these artworks need specific kinds of care. And so we were also thinking about how plants then become co-creators in the space and how they become part of the exhibition. So there was no corn maze at the Contemporary Art Center. They were like, no, absolutely not. But Lorena was able to do that somewhere else. And so again, I think these are always interesting ways of thinking about, like, if we're wanting to do these exhibitions about plants and ecologies, what are the possibilities and limitations of actually bringing like, aliveness into the gallery space? How does that kind of resonate in different ways? So we did end up having one installation with live plants that you see here in the front, Rashid Johnson's work, Untitled Strangers. And we were really happy to have this installation. The CAC staff, I think, was also happy, but they did have to water these plants and monitor them and kind of, again, speaking to the mechanisms of the institution and the care that kind of came into this. It is a live installation, so there were kind of different considerations about what this meant in terms of lighting and putting it together. And so we were specifically excited to have this piece because Rashid Johnson is really interested in themes of healing in his practice. The installation includes not only plants, but books, as well as shea butter and black soap. And Rashid Johnson very specifically kind of speaks to using shea butter as a sort of signifier of different like routes of migration. And one of the ways that he's kind of asking visitors to approach this is to kind of think about what then black soap or shea butter starts to signify in different contexts. So whether it be like Brooklyn or Harlem, he also thinks about the slipperiness of shea butter and how that may translate to ideas of Black diasporic belonging. And so for Johnson, this work, even though it is kind of static and stationary, it is also about change. It is about the plants changing, wilting, flowering, about the care that goes into it. And then kind of, again, that kind of multi-species relationship of inviting people to think that they're in the space with the plants as opposed to just kind of visiting the installation as something that starts to belong to the space. Again, these are like broader conversations, I think, from a curatorial point of view that are interesting and challenging to kind of think about if it's possible to kind of break open those kind of exhibition spaces and do that work differently. So behind Johnson's work here, you'll see Torkwase Dyson's work way over there inside me, Ocean as a Super Thruway. These are 6 paintings from 2019. And Torkwase Dyson kind of takes on the ongoing legacies of plantation economies by drawing connections between ecology, infrastructure, and environmental racism. And, we were particularly interested in this work as an extension of this conversation about ecologies to kind of show how ecology links to systems of architecture, water infrastructure, as well as the oil and gas industry. And these kind of abstract shapes and forms that Dyson is known for also in itself constitute this vocabulary of grammar. And Dyson works with what she has called and coined Black compositional theory, which considers how waterways, architecture, objects, and geographies are composed and inhabited by Black bodies. And then at the same time, she also looks at the properties of energy and space and scale and how that kind of informs networks of liberation. So having this work in Cincinnati felt really important to us. It felt like a way that we could also connect thinking about the Underground Railroad as well as the Ohio River, and kind of, invite continuous reflections on the ideas of freedom, and really kind of thinking about these histories as a political position and movement, and not oversimplifying these ideas of freedom by just merely like kind of crossing like certain like geographical borders. And this kind of way of thinking, especially because the CAC is really good with working with our educational department, inviting, folks into the exhibition space, works like this that are kind of abstract in form also became a way for younger people to come in the exhibition space and kind of like think about that, right? Think about where they are located. As somebody who's not from Cincinnati, but I've been here for the last 5 years, it is truly often very striking to me that my students have very little idea about where they are, right? Where they are located. What does it mean to live in Cincinnati? And what does it mean to kind of be here and like see and engage with the river, right? So how does that kind of reverberate in their understanding of belonging? And so it was interesting to have some of these works also speak to where we are. Right, and then this work, this is a vinyl piece that we put up in the gallery space by Firele Baez, who's a New York-based artist, and she thinks with diasporic histories and the imaginative, and she often includes plant life, literary references, as well as different kind of emblems of healing. And this work, which is titled "Everything I Know About Love, I Invented," she's kind of tapping into oceanic imagery, and also speaking to those broader histories of Black diaspora and the Middle Passage. Specifically here, she's engaging with Edward Glissant's work to think about the theory of the ocean as connector and repository of memory. And also in this kind of piece, she is drawing on the Afrofuturist mythology developed by Drexia, which is a Detroit-based music duo. And so this is like existing work that she had, but she, when we invited her to be part of this exhibition, she also wanted to think about how these histories could be layered in conversation with Cincinnati. So you can't really see it from the audience probably, but underneath this map is a map of Farmers College in College Hill, which is a map from 1860, and that map kind of covers part of the Underground Railroad, which is a network of people, places, and routes that made it possible for enslaved people to escape to the north. And so in these conversations with artists, again, I think part of the kind of the curatorial practice where possible and where there was capacity, artists were also interested in kind of thinking with how they could correspond to these different stories and conversations that were happening in Cincinnati. So that map was kind of like layered underneath this piece. And this kind of work then also kind of acknowledges these different bodies of water, making connections between the Atlantic as well as the Ohio River. So staying with some of these oceanic connections and the imaginary, I'll share some of Lisandro Surreal's work, who's a Caribbean artist who grew up in St. Martin. And this work is part of a series called Ghost Island, which is based on Surreal's interest in magic realism and kind of moves towards undoing New World imagination, and is really kind of keen in thinking about what it would mean to generate different kinds of vantage points. So thinking about the positioning often in his work, there's a lot of like invitation to think about how we kind of shift the way we kind of approach the Atlantic, who is like looking ahead or who is looking in, and there's a lot of interesting play around that. So I'll share a bit more about the series. Ghost Island offers this imaginative entry point into the layered and contested colonial histories in the West Indies, and specifically in St. Martin. The series weaves together mythology, spectrality, and hauntology to evoke a sensuous experience. Ghost Island portrays Black people within a dreamlike surrealistic constellation to contemplate other ways of knowing. And within this series of Ghost Island, Surreal's kind of building this world in which fiction and reality undo each other. It's a communion with ghosts, spirits, the water, the moon, palms, and foliage. And Ghost Island is not just about constructing otherworldliness rooted in mythology. It is about asking larger questions about Caribbean identity and the Black imagination. And so I actually wrote about this work before inviting him into the show. And it was really beautiful to kind of have the work, the series, a couple of pieces in the series, in the exhibition. This specific piece kind of meditates on cotton. And so Surreal's really interested in reclaiming historical and indigenous ties to cotton beyond the colonial realm. So specifically in his research, he looks into wild cotton and what the Taino call sarobai, which is kind of predated the appearance of cultivated cotton in Europe and Asia. And so with this work, Lisandro Surreal was really interested in kind of thinking about what are other ways of knowing, how can you kind of weave this kind of research into the realm of magic realism, and what does that in terms of like artistic practice, right? So kind of acknowledging these like histories of violence while also imagining otherwise is really at the root of his practice. And Lisandro is also part of the Tidal Studies Group that I mentioned earlier. So we've been thinking together about water and ecologies and plants in this like broader diasporic context. And again, that kind of, that form of like collaboration that kind of shifts from different modes of working together alongside an exhibition or writing about an artist's work and then kind of collaborating in other capacities has been an interesting way of kind of staying in conversation, right? So often when we're like, curating exhibitions, there's like, you put everything together, some people come, some people you never meet, and you kind of like float apart. And so this is an interesting, different way of kind of thinking about collaboration to different mediums. Right. So there are several diasporic connections that were woven into the exhibition. This is an installation by Kibwani Kiwanga called Cements, which is exploring the history of the movement of grains of rice and how rice traveled with enslaved people in clothing or braided into hair from West Africa to the Americas. And this piece specifically is grappling with African rice, a particular type of rice that was once thought as the lost crop of enslaved Africans and which was rediscovered in Suriname. And actually, as I was speaking with Judith yesterday, I was kind of reminded of the research that Kiwanga did, and amongst others kind of did this really close study of rice and worked with Tinde van Andel, who has this really incredible scholarship around these different crops of rice. And so these rice grains are actually ceramic sculptures. Again, this was a big feat to install. They had to like count out like 15,000 grains of rice and then like put them together in this like arrangement. Also, this kind of platform installation invited a lot of kids to kind of think that this was kind of a nice deep dive situation, or, and so there was this interesting kind of monitoring of the space where we didn't want to close it off because we wanted people to be able to experience the work. But also, there was a real interesting kind of tension between keeping this installation as is and having to place rice grains back into it. So related to these themes, I just wanted to very briefly highlight a different exhibition. So kind of like leaving for a moment the Ecologies of Elsewhere exhibition to tell you a little bit about Patricia Cartahout, who is a Surinamese artist, Afro-Surinamese artist, and also a dear friend and collaborator. And her practice is really interested in kind of thinking about the different ways in which we might like undo and rethink the impact of Dutch colonialism, and specifically kind of bringing in these different types of works that kind of make us think in different ways how we may read or read against the grain or with the grain and kind of shift our perception. So I had the honor of curating her solo show in 2023. It was a busy year for me. And in several series, Patricia Carsahout is kind of thinking with indigenous and African botanical knowledge. So this kind of, I included this because I realized that some of Mark's research was also touching on this. So in this series, Palimpsest and Erasure, Patricia's drawing on Maria Sibylla Merian's work, who was a German naturalist who lived in Amsterdam, traveled to Suriname with her daughter. There's a piece right there by her, and so she wrote the Metamorphoses of the Insects of Suriname, which was self-published in 1705. And so here, Patricia's kind of using, this is a textile piece, that was done by the Textile Museum in the Netherlands. But she's kind of using this as a way to think about like the structure of a book and the different like ways of layering. And so she kind of shades over the original drawings. And then in the background, which I'm not sure if you can see from there, she kind of places the bodies of women on the page to kind of trouble that assumption that Marion was able to conduct all that work without enslaved women and indigenous women who kind of had that knowledge, right? And so she was kind of like simultaneously thinking about the violence of these histories and also thinking how through her artwork, she wanted to grapple with these questions of repair and healing. And I think that has been like a big part of her practice. And so she's done different workshops around this. There are different iterations of how she's using these histories. So this is a textile piece. We had 2 big textile pieces in the exhibition, but she also has other modalities in which she explores these histories. And so again, kind of like thinking about these questions of ecologies and knowledge production and how within these like artistic practices, there's like kind of this pushback around like the ownership of knowledge, or who gets acknowledged, who doesn't get acknowledged. And I wanted to share some of that work. All right, so I'm coming back to the Ecologies of Elsewhere exhibition. And both Portia and I were really interested in how this exhibition could generate different ideas about place through like kind of a close listening experience. And also we were kind of thinking about, what emerges when we pay attention to different registers in which soil, plants, and water kind of speak. So I wanted to share some of the work of Ilse Wolff, who's an architect and scholar and writer based in Cape Town. And we included her film Summer Flowers, which explores the life and work of the South African author and activist Bessie Head. So Bessie Head, if you're not familiar, left apartheid South Africa and lived in exile in Serowe in Botswana, where she wrote the novel When Rain Clouds Gather. And so in this short film, Ilse Wolff is kind of inviting viewers to spend time with the home and garden of Bessie Head. And as an architect, Wolff is really interested in how we can think differently about the garden, and specifically how gardens can become sites of like liberation. And so that's something that she was interested in kind of like exploring in this work. Bessie Head built her house, Rain Clouds, in 1969 in Botswana with the proceeds of her first novel, When Rain Clouds Gather. And she also worked with people in Serowe as a gardener and as part of a communal gardening project. And that gardening project would later become like part of her writing as well. So this work for us was really interesting because it was kind of grappling with like ideas of home and garden, spatiality, histories of apartheid. And so we also, as part of the Ecologies of Elsewhere exhibition, some of our programming was about backyard. So we wanted to kind of, again, thinking about the limitations of bringing live plants into the exhibition space. Some of the programming that we did some backyard events where we wanted to kind of think about, again, the garden as this political, imaginative site, and we visited different people's backyards to kind of talk about what they're growing. Julia El Bianco, who is based in Cincinnati, an artist, did a backyard session and talked about the medicinal herbs that she's growing. She's from Argentina and does a lot of work around plants and herbs. And so this was a way to kind of like, again, get people outside of the exhibition space and kind of get people to think about the garden. What do gardens mean? How do plants and flowers and seeds become bound up with these questions of space, race, and possession? Some of these histories that kind of seep into this work, specifically within a South African context, thinking about the project of botanic gardens in Europe, the Dutch East India Company, the officials were known to kind of send seeds and plants from India and the Cape Colony to Dutch botanical gardens. And so those histories, of course, also speak to questions of domestication and like kind of the taming of so-called exotic plants. And so gardening practices really tell us something about land politics and access, who is granted access to land, who can cultivate food and keep seed. Gardens often perform different kinds of functions, right? We can think about the garden as a communal, intergenerational, and subversive site. And this is exactly what kind of Ilse Wolff wanted to do with this work. And as an architect, again, really wanting to think about the spatial logics of the garden, but also about the kind of the interior lives of like people that we read, right? So how they kind of, were thinking about their own space and their gardens and the ways that they kind of made life. And briefly kind of hopping between different curatorial projects, but related to the South African context. At the time when Bessie Head was kind of doing a lot of this gardening, there was also, at the same time, really violent destruction of Black neighborhoods under the Group Areas Act in apartheid, specifically the 1913 Land Act, and then later the 1950s Apartheid Group Areas Act. And those kind of like ramifications of forest removals are still like palpable today. And so related to these questions around land and histories of apartheid, in 2018, I co-curated this exhibition with Zara Julius, who's an artist based in Joburg. And we kind of used our own family archives to kind of think about these questions of land. So as I mentioned in the beginning, my family on my dad's side is South African Indian, and so we were classified as Indian under apartheid. Zara's family was classified as colored under apartheid, which, these are like complex kind of terminologies, but what often happened under the apartheid regime, that people were just like classified in one way or another. And that meant that you kind of, were cut from your community, friends, people that you lived with, and also how land then became like divided and deeply racialized. And so we were interested in kind of delving into family photo albums to think about how those histories are like unspoken and spoken in different ways. So the Group Areas Act that I mentioned in 1950 kind of divided up land and different areas. Again, this kind of breaking up of families and friends and communities. And of course, like the Group Areas Act kind of impacted the lives of Black South Africans most severely. But in that process of classification, also kind of situated people who were racialized as Indian and colored to specific areas in Durban, which very much so kind of impacted their relationship and access to like gardens, green spaces, land, etc. So as I mentioned, we were interested in family photo albums. And so these are some photos of my family. And we were kind of, we had a section around all these different photos that were either wedding photos in botanical gardens, because that was kind of like, working class access to the botanical garden as a wedding photo backdrop was really common. But also the kind of the backdrop for birthdays, weddings, gatherings, and again, kind of thinking with these spatial structures of land in this way and how it becomes represented in something like the family photo album was a really interesting way for us to kind of trace the spatial structures of anti-Blackness, right? So similarly, in Durban, where my family's from, the beach is divided into a Black section, a colored section, an Indian section, and even Now, when you go to the beach, we have like tradition, we'll go to the beach for Christmas. Like Indian families will be on the Indian side of the beach, right? So how these histories kind of like reverberate and how that kind of speaks to these anti-Black logics of land, of water, of ownership, becomes like a really important kind of part of the work of thinking about ecologies, right, and who has access to them. So in similar ways, in the Ecologies of Elsewhere exhibition, so just kind of like jumping back to that, we wanted to think about how we could represent some of those conversations that both Portia Malaji, my co-curator, and I were always already thinking with, right? So Portia is Black South African, I'm South African Indian, and so our conversations, our friendship, our exchanges had always been structured about these different things that our families grow, right? So I'm like kind of coming from a context where we're growing kind of, again, histories of indentured labor. So like we're growing mangoes and like curry leaves and like, the different ways in which that arrived in Durban. And so a lot of our conversations were around like our family practices, different things. I was growing zucchini at some point, and it was like mid-pandemic, and she was like, oh, you can like eat the leaves, right? And so her mom came on FaceTime to show me how to like kind of do it. And so it was a whole like kind of practice of sharing and kind of cultivating that. So for the Ecologies exhibition, again, we were interested in how could we translate some of those conversations to Cincinnati, and we invited Made You Look, so a Johannesburg-based interdisciplinary artist collaboration between Molema Moya and Nara Mohoto. And they kind of take as their point of departure everyday Black practices that have been either overlooked or deemed inconsequential. And so they installed this garden in front of the CAC space, which also featured archival material. And the idea was kind of to have it in front of the CAC, one, because again, we had a limitation of how many live plants and gardens could happen in the space, but also to kind of think about how our institutions are implicated in these kind of anti-Black kind of spatial considerations, and especially in like downtown areas where, art museums are kind of gesturing this openness, but at the same time, there's this kind of like policing of who can come in, who can't come in. And so they were interested in making this installation and seeing if this could be an extension, a kind of like a welcoming way of having people part of the exhibition. So this installation was part actually of an ongoing installation that they have installed in South Africa, in the UK, in Germany, called E Giardini, which kind of explores township gardens as a site of creativity and belonging. Again, thinking with these ideas of dislocation and displacement, and then extending the kind of colonial inheritances of botany. So again, as I said earlier, they kind of link the garden very specifically to other colonial structures, such as the art museum. And so they very purposely wanted to kind of make that connection and ask those questions. So they worked together with Malik Wilkins, who was an intern at the CAC at the time. And Malik did all this really interesting archival research to kind of connect histories of Black gardening in Johannesburg to Ohio and Kentucky. And so they were including these images into the garden installation. So these were some of the ways in which, again, it's a limited kind of space to have one exhibition in which this work can happen. But Made You Look has this as an ongoing installation, inviting people into these different kind of garden constructions to kind of think about the broader kind of reverberations and histories, and kind of making those diasporic connections in ways through archival materials or through conversations, or just inviting people to reflect on their relationship with land and growing. So in closing, I wanted to share, and this is one more image from that installation. I want to share some of Zayan Khan's work, who we recently invited to do a workshop at the Taft Research Center on seeds, and thinking about our relationship to seeds. And so her work has been really instrumental to kind of thinking about the healing potential of plants and practices. And so I was not involved in this exhibition, but I was lucky to see it in Cape Town a few years ago, and I'm weaving it into a second book project that I'm working on that kind of looks at the histories of Dutch colonialism in South Africa and Indonesia, Dutch Caribbean, Suriname, and kind of looking at the ways in which the Dutch kind of managed or mismanaged water and land and the reverberations of that. So I won't go into the history, but the violence of Dutch colonialism meant that they kind of shifted irrigation, dammed water, dammed access to fresh water. They replicated canal systems in different places of the world as a sort of like colonial nostalgia mastery project. And so those kind of, when we kind of say climate change, and I think particularly in the art world, there's been like this kind of turn to speak about climate change, right? And to kind of bring it into these exhibition spaces. And often, that is not always paired enough with kind of thinking about colonial projects. So I'm kind of interested in how the Dutch colonial project continues to kind of like impact the way we think about land and water. And so in this specific book project, I kind of look at contemporary artists, activists, people kind of working alongside water and soil and plants, and see how they're kind of connecting and shifting some of the conversations in response to those different kind of sites of violences. And so Zayan Khan is one of the artists that I'm kind of writing about. Zayan Khan is a transdisciplinary artist and storyteller engaging relations of land, food, and seed. And so her practice, I think, is really interesting because she also sets up seed kind of libraries in Cape Town and kind of does that work of inviting folks to bring in seeds, to share kind of ideas of seed. South Africa still has like a lot of like load shedding power outages. So she's also really interested in other ways of preservation. Also does a lot of work around kind of fermentation. And so I'm kind of thinking about her work also as a different model of care, right? Kind of thinking about how care is embedded in her practice. And so in her solo exhibition, a practice in light and death, she's kind of exploring these cycles of living and dying. And she attunes to these more than human interactions with light, water, and death to contemplate how we might hold the weight of grief, of genocide and dispossession in the Cape, and tying that idea of like the ecocide informing genocide and vice versa. So in part of her work, and these are just some images of that exhibition, she's very specifically kind of points to these microbial worlds and the importance of kind of locating care and attention to scale, and the invisibility of micropolitics. And then at the same time kind of zooms out and looks at mass extinction and how colonial invasions and genocide kind of remind us of the different scales these issues play out on. So while her work is situated in South Africa, she also extends her analysis to Palestine. And in my kind of reading of this work, which, I kind of have a transnational feminist queer reading of this work, to kind of think about this different relationship, this multi-species kind of kinship and practice that has been at the center of Indigenous, Black, and women of color feminisms. And so kind of using this work to rethink feminist queer relation, as well as kind of thinking about how this work, again, shifts between these different scales of violence and these different scales of cycles of life and death, and like invites different forms of engagement with what that kind of brings up for people. So I'm almost coming to an end here. So she draws on practices such as fermentation, as I said, and she suggests, and I'm quoting her here, that a collection of fermented food teaches gentle death making towards having foods more alive in their death with trillions of invisible bacteria, end of quote. And she had this as part of the exhibition, and kind of, again, thinking about these different kind of cycles of fermentation. What does fermentation do, right? Like it extends, it preserves, And so this was up for the duration of the exhibition. And people were able to come in for different kinds of workshops and conversations. And so I've been really interested in how these different practices can be kind of a site of thinking with plants in a broader sense as a site of kind of like healing and as well as change. So I'm going to close with some more of Zayan's writing in relationship to this exhibition. All right, I bear witness every day, every night. In the same way that we work to move grief to our bodies from the land, the stories of the genocides that happened here in the Cape, now buried in the rocks and mountain and sands and seas. In every offering I make, every visit to the mountain, to the sea, every time I dig, every time I bury, it is always there. So I maintain my process and practice in light and death and work towards creating space to share that with others, to unravel it just a bit, that we can find ways of supporting each other. Thank you.